All right, let's get started. Thanks again for being here. My name is Amelia Neptune. I'm the director of the Bicycle Friendly America program at the League of American Bicyclists, and we are very excited to co-host today's webinar with our friends at EcoCounter. The webinar today is called Bikes Count in the Big Easy, a snapshot of cycling in New Orleans. And if you're watching live today, I wanted to note a couple logistical things. Closed captions should be enabled for you, and you can hide or show those captions depending on your preference. There is a Q&A box where you are more than welcome to ask questions at any time throughout the webinar, and we should have time for Q&A at the end. And we are recording this, and we'll share the recording and the slides out with everybody who registered after the fact. With that, I'm going to just share a quick intro and then hand it over to our awesome speakers. So if you're not familiar with the League of American Bicyclists, we are a national nonprofit bike advocacy organization leading the movement to build a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. And we do that through a number of programs. You might be familiar with our Smart Cycling program, which trains and certifies people to teach bike safety in their communities through our League Cycling Instructor program. We host National Bike Month. We host the National Bike Summit, which I'll mention again in a minute. We have a number of resources and reports for local advocates, and we do federal advocacy on Capitol Hill, advocating for the rights of bicyclists all across the country. And on that note, we just opened registration for our 2024 National Bike Summit, which is a great conference and lobby day on Capitol Hill, bringing cyclists from all over to join together in support of bicycling. And so we're very excited about next year's National Bike Summit in DC, March 19th through the 21st, and you can already register at bikeleague.org/summit. We'd love to see you there. And if you're on this webinar, you're probably interested in data, and I wanted to make sure you're aware of our website, the benchmarking website, which is at data.bikeleague.org. And thanks to a partnership with Active People, Healthy Nation, which is the CDC's initiative to get 27 million Americans to be more active by 2027. And this is a website full of data from various national sources all around biking and walking. So here's just a screenshot of one of our latest reports on that website, but I encourage you to check it out if you're here because you're into data. It's a really great resource, and I encourage you to view it. And like I said, I'm the director of the Bicycle Friendly America program at the League. And through this program, we evaluate states, communities, businesses, and universities. And we give out awards, and we give out feedback on how to improve. And data collection and tracking the number of people writing is a really important part of our evaluation process for all of these programs. And there's a lot of different ways to collect data, from the high-tech automated counters to surveys and qualitative data to a workplace that has a great paper chart on the wall where people track every mile that they ride to work. We encourage all of it, and we really value the importance of data collection. And that's one of the reasons we love this ongoing partnership that we have with EcoCounter through the BFA program, where we've provided a number of resources over the years. This is one of many webinars we've done with them, so I encourage you to check out our webinar archives. And we've done a lot of webinars on how to do counts and best practices around counts. And today's webinar is focused on what to do once you have data and once you're already counting, but you don't quite know what to do with all of that data. And so this year we hosted for the third time our annual Bikes Count data competition, which is really all around that idea of helping people who have the data figure out what to do with it for storytelling, for advocacy, for figuring out what it looks like in terms of understanding bicycling in their community. So like I said, this is the third year we've done this competition where we invite people to send us their data, and together we choose a winning group to receive in-kind assistance from EcoCounter's data experts to help analyze their data. And so you probably already figured out who the winner is this year, but the University of New Orleans Transportation Institute submitted a really awesome application. And one of the reasons we loved their application to the Bikes Count data competition is because it wasn't just them. It was a combination of advocates, the city, and these institutional research partners working together to collect data and try to understand data in the city of New Orleans. So I am so excited to hand the webinar over to our friends at EcoCounter. I'll hand it off to Olivia, and then we'll hear from all the folks in New Orleans to tell us all about what they learned through this process. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you, Olivia. Thanks.
Thanks, Amelia. I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Olivia. I work with EcoCounter, and I've worked with Tara over the past few years, helping to manage the count program in New Orleans. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the systems that were used to collect continuous count data in New Orleans, and a bit more about the data validation and reconstruction process. So data validation and reconstruction, that's one of the processes that we used when we took a look at some of the count data from New Orleans when we started to create the visualization. So I'll go into a bit about the methodology there, and after the other presentations, we'll do questions. So a bit about EcoCounter. If you haven't heard about EcoCounter before, we do manufacturing and design of bicycle and pedestrian counting systems, both permanent and mobile. Today, we're going to be focusing just on permanent bicycle counters. That's the type of data that we were looking at with New Orleans. We work with different agencies, public agencies, advocacy groups to develop account programs across North America. And we really want to push this data-driven approach to planning. So making sure you have some good ground truth data to make those important decisions. First, we're going to be looking at different types of bicycle counters. We're just going to be focusing on permanent bicycle counters today, and then we'll look at the validation and reconstruction processes. So ZELT counters are our signature permanent bicycle counter. They're a counter that will count cyclists and tell you the direction of travel that they're moving in. So if they're going inbound or outbound. These are counters that are suited for permanent installations. They can be installed on street. So if it's a mixed traffic space with vehicles and bicycles moving within the same space, they can fit there, as well as in more like trail environments. And it will give you counts continuously 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. These systems they use a sensor that's an electromagnetic sensor. So there's a loop wire that's installed underground and then sealed up. We can see here in the photo, it's a diamond-shaped loop. And this is embedded in the pavement or the soil if it's a trail scenario. And the systems are autonomous, they're battery powered. That means you can kind of install them, and then they'll collect data for a number of years before you have to do the battery replacement, usually a year or two. A little bit more about the sensor. So the sensor itself, it's electromagnetic, as I said before, and the wheels of the bicycle, it's looking for the metal content in the first wheel and the second wheel as it passes over the sensor. And this means it's not really looking for the metal content in the body of the bike, because there's different types of bikes out there. We all know that there's carbon fiber bikes. And if we're looking for just the wheel content and the metal in the wheel, that allows us to have that signature detected as the first wheel and the second wheel pass over that diamond-shaped loop. So this is also just a diagram I wanted to show what the inside of the counter looked like. So we have those loops embedded in the pavement, and those are connected to a manhole and that's going to house like the battery, the sensor, and the data logger. And that data logger will send the data each day to a website, and that's where you can go and view all of your count data. So that's great. You have your count data coming from your bicycle counter. There's lots of different things you can do with that count data. Just within a few weeks, you can really get a picture of how people are moving about on different pathways and bike lanes and trail systems. You can use it to kind of estimate long-term numbers for how many people are going to be using these certain spaces. And as you go down the line, you can do much like larger analysis and using it to kind of quantify economic impact and do data fusion with other sources. So it's exciting once you get to start collect that long-term data. This is just a visualization of kind of what some count data can look like. So this is taken from a bike counter where we can see really clear patterns of commuting on this pathway. So we have these really high peaks here for the weekdays during the morning and the evening, and then lower counts that we see on Saturday and Sunday pretty consistently. So this is just an example of space where it's really clearly being used for commuting and not so much for recreational riding on the weekend. But sometimes we see there are gaps in data, and this can happen for a number of reasons that I'll discuss. But this is another example of a bicycle counter that experienced a data gap. And we can see that happened for a month in August and September of this year. And yeah, so there's no data there, and it creates an issue when we're trying to do these long-term analyses of how people are using a certain space and how many people are out there biking. So this is, it happens to lots of different people that are using these automated counters. And this was something that we had seen a little bit in New Orleans, in the New Orleans data. So we wanted to correct some of these data gaps, and our validation and reconstruction methods are what we used for that. So these data gaps can happen for a number of different reasons. Data gaps and data anomalies can show up. Another example is shown here where there's just kind of a very sharp decrease in counts. And this can often be caused by environmental factors, because these are counts that are coming from the real world. And the real world means there's lots of different things going on in the environment. So there's often construction that will happen that will block a bike lane. And if your counter is in the middle of the bike lane, you're not going to get any counts. People might be biking on the roadway around the construction or being rerouted to a completely, entirely different road. Sometimes there's repairs are happening on certain trail networks. Sometimes you just have delivery vehicles that are blocking the counter, or people are parked in a bike lane and they're kind of weaving around a counter. So there's many different reasons why these anomalies will come about, or these decreases in data or data gaps will happen. And it's important to keep an eye on your data and look at it consistently so that you can catch them kind of early on. Some other reasons why there might be data gaps: dead batteries. These are battery powered systems. So if the batteries aren't replaced on time, they will start to lose their ability to count, and that will create a gap. Sometimes vandalism can come into play, and that will cause a data gap. Or sometimes there's just an object that's blocking the sensor, and that's more temporary, but it will cause an anomaly in the data. And yeah, this is just reflecting the idea that these are counters, they're out in the real world, and keeping an eye on the data is going to help us to make sure those data gaps don't happen, or those data anomalies don't happen for extended periods of time. Here are some testimonials, I guess, or reports of data gaps or data anomalies that have happened that we saw in some of the public reports of count data, just to show that this is a very common issue that many people report once they start to collect automated counts with counters. Just for various reasons, there will be gaps in the data. And when you're doing these kind of year-end reports that show this is like a snapshot of the year, a picture of the year, you have to put this little disclaimer that, oh, there was a gap here for one reason or another. Battery wasn't replaced, or there just wasn't usable data for a certain period. But just to show that it's a common issue. So if this is something that you're seeing in your own bicycle count data, know that there's lots of other people out there experiencing this. So in order to kind of remedy this, or create some sort of solution for it, we as a company, we kind of started to develop some methodology around how do we do data cleaning and data validation. So it's important to kind of look at this as an issue for all counters if you want to do year-over-year growth, or just looking at longer term analysis, or any type of fusion with other data sources, because you want to make sure you have the most accurate data possible. So for this reason, we started to create some validation reconstruction services, and looking at different types of reasons why there's anomalies in data, and then figuring out how do we reconstruct those in a way that is, it's as accurate as possible. And I guess, I'll show here. This is just an example kind of how data might appear if it's an anomaly. There's just no data that happens one day and then it bounces back the next. This is, something might be blocking the sensor or blocking people from biking over the sensor, that sort of thing. So types of anomalies, kind of alluded to some of these before. Zero counts, so a long period of time where there's just no counts being detected. That might be something like a battery not being replaced. Days with no data or null data. Extremely high counts. So just, much more than there usually is. Incomplete days, so days, when there's some data for a few hours and then it just kind of drops off. Also, like, there's direction detection for these counters. So if we see there's a large imbalance in the in and out ratio, when usually, it's pretty balanced, that's another indication that that's an anomaly. We need to check that out. And as well, just looking at historical data, that's a really important part of anomaly detection, is how did this site and how did counts appear at this site historically, and did something change all of a sudden? So in doing this count anomaly detection, this is something that we use, some of our own software systems to detect those anomalies. And then those are reviewed by one of our data experts. And once we detect all of those anomalies, they're then communicated to the person who owns that counting equipment and collects that data. And there's a discussion that happens about what might have caused the data gap or the data anomaly. And once it's confirmed that, there wasn't a bike race happening that day, and instead there was something that was causing really high counts at the counter, that's when we can go and start to do the reconstruction of the data. So I just wanted to show here, this is an example of a reconstruction. So we can see there is a pretty significant jump in counts that's followed by a gap in data. So there was something that happened here that caused the sensor to, it wasn't picking up the correct amount. And then afterwards, after the reconstruction, we can see a much more normalized kind of view of the counts. So the counts are reconstructed down to the smallest time interval, so 15-minute or hourly bins, using a model that's developed using historical relationships with highly correlated nearby reference counters. So it's important, if you want to do reconstruction, that you have a network of counters that you can use, as you're not kind of relying on them to show what was going on during that period of, this is a July 2021. So using that reference counter model, that allows us to kind of control for things like weather that was happening around that time, or maybe events that were happening around that time. So that's an important part of how the reconstruction is done. And the estimate of the errors generated by testing the model on a segment of good data, either before or after the period requiring reconstruction. So one last piece about data reconstruction, why it's important. When properly validated, count data is a valuable metric that we can use to help plan investments, measure the success of our actions, and communicate with the public. And at the end of the day, people look to count data as really ground truth data. It's an unbiased source. And because of that, I think it really deserves a validation process. So I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but it is an important part of collecting count data and using it. And I think I'll hand it over to Tara to start talking about the specific examples we saw in New Orleans and all the wonderful historical count data we have there.
Thank you so much. I will swap out our screen. All right, so hello everybody. I'm Tara Tolford. I'm a researcher and instructor at the University of New Orleans Transportation Institute. I'm joined here today by Jennifer Rulli with the City of New Orleans and Aline Laspina, Executive Director of Bicyclists. We'll come back to them in a little bit, who are my partners on this project. And New Orleans, in case you're not familiar, is a place where we spend a ton of time out in the streets. So we take them over on a regular basis for all kinds of reasons, from Mardi Gras to Sunday afternoon second lines, to using bikes to get to festivals or civil disobedience. We are out there on a regular basis more than anywhere else that I have seen in the United States. And along with that, it's also a place with this really rich history, specifically around active transportation and recreation. It's a city where nearly 20% of households lack access to a vehicle. And so it's really been a long time a fundamental part of the city's economic life too, for people getting to work, whether it's longshoremen going to port back in the day or folks getting to their gigs in the hospitality sector now. There's also this rich culture around bicycling in particular that has grown over the last 15 years or so, and that is sort of uniquely New Orleans. So we have this sort of slew of every night there's a different social ride somewhere in the city, and that's in addition to all the road races and naked bike rides and all that stuff that lots of cities have. And despite all this, decision makers historically have not necessarily known a ton about how people were walking and biking in the community, other than their anecdotal experience, maybe. And particularly that's the case in lower income or low vehicle ownership neighborhoods, where maybe the bike and pedestrian infrastructure is not as robust in the first place. And those communities are, of course, also the ones that are least likely to be well represented in planning process. On the other hand, our city engineers tend to have been counting cars for decades. Those programs always get funded. They're often required by law. They happen year after year at dozens or hundreds of locations. So that's kind of a mismatch. That's where we come in, is to start to collect real data about how and where and when people are bicycling, is just about normalizing this idea that people count no matter how we get around. And broadly speaking, there's lots of reasons why we might want to count people. Here's just some of the major ones that have come up a lot in our work, from just basic benchmarking to understanding current conditions, to planning for the future, practically to support grant applications. That comes up a lot. And just this basic idea that if you want people to pay attention to something, you do need to be actively monitoring it. It's also worth noting that, like in lots of cities over the last couple of decades, New Orleans has been expanding its bike facilities from just a handful of really isolated trail segments to this growing and more connected network, while also in recent years making some upgrades to older facilities over time. And as this has been happening, city staff and advocates have really had to repeatedly make the case that, yes, this is a valid use of our time and money. It's necessary. It serves a constituency. It's not just a trend, but it's about actually meeting the needs of real people who already exist in the city. So as of this year, we're up in the range of about 150 miles of facilities, depending on how you measure. And as Jennifer with the city can attest, this is every single one of those miles has taken effort and real work. So for the last 13 years now, the University of New Orleans has been sort of the leading partner in using pedestrian and bicycle counts as a simple, relatively low-cost-ish tool to support our government and our community partners in advocating for changes to policy and to the built environment. This started way back in 2010, just a couple of years after the city built its very first bike lane. This was in partnership with our MPO. We had a limited budget, handful of student workers, a great asset in any counting program, certainly. This was a project called the Pedestrian Bicycle Resource Initiative, and it went on for 7 years. And during that time, we grew from just 12 manual count sites, sending students to go sit on the side of the road and count bikes, to more than 70 count sites in rotation. And that included getting our first mobile and permanent automated counters, which were a very, very now obsolete model of eco-pyro from back in the day. And we put out these annual reports that would document the overall trends in usage and in demographics and in behaviors that we're seeing. And we started with just one counter on a shared use trail right in the heart of the city, where we got to see that usage increase year after year after year for a decade. And the most important thing here was we were able to work toward this idea that multimodal data collection should be a routine process, something we can do, that we should do as part of planning. And we got to share that idea and that message with local and regional stakeholders. And we were so successful in doing that, in fact, that we got the attention of our state DOT. And Louisiana is a state that's had a complete streets policy since 2010, but has, struggled to implement it over time, and hasn't really been taking care of measuring whether or not it was working as intended. So to address this, we started working with Louisiana Transportation Research Center to figure out a framework for scaling up the work that we've been doing in New Orleans to other areas of the state. And that led to the installation of an initial pilot set of permanent counters, both in New Orleans and in a couple of other cities. Right around that same time, we also sort of renewed our partnership with the city, specifically with the city and with Bike Easy, and with some support from People for Bikes through a program called the Big Jump Project. And that helped us to leverage our resources to make sure that data collection and evaluating that data was part of the city's build out of a planned network of rapid build facilities that was underway. And so that support allowed us to add a little bit to our small fleet of count stations, and included adding some portable counters to the mix so that we could measure before and after some of these projects took place. So this map here is just illustrating the range of locations where we have been collecting data over the years, with the green and purple indicating automated counters, and some of those green ones are the ones we're focusing on today. So that leads us to where we're at now. Currently, this work is supported through a grant from our local energy utilities foundation, and they recognized that there was value in being able to show the impacts of the city's investments in infrastructure, and that City Hall maybe needed a little bit of a capacity boost to get that done. So after over a decade of collecting all this data for all sorts of different types of government sponsors, we were sitting on this just mountain of data, but we hadn't ever really had an opportunity to distill it down and share it in a way that regular people would want to look at, or would have the ability to sort of interpret, other than the long, boring technical reports and Excel workbooks that would get produced. So the explicit purpose of this project was actually just to not just keep going with the count activities themselves, although that was part of it, but to specifically focus out on sharing this information in a way that's more accessible, and so that it can better inform planning for safe streets and for promoting a culture of health. So that meant getting outside of just the university bubble. UNO has been leading the project, but it's very much been a team effort. The City of New Orleans has been super engaged as a partner, with actually several different departments at City Hall participating on a regular basis, meeting every month to drive this forward. We've also been working with our wonderful local advocacy organization, Bike Easy, and they have been really instrumental in helping to de-nerd all of this data and engage the public. We've also continued to work with our MPO, with other nonprofits, including our community bike share, as well as with partners at the state level, to leverage various activities and assets to meet everybody. And now, of course, that list also includes EcoCounter and League of American Bicyclists for helping to sort of deepen our ability to make sense of this data and share what we learned. So specifically, our pitch for the data competition was, we have a mountain of data, but we haven't necessarily had the time or the tools to go back and stitch it all together and fill in some of the gaps, and looking at specifically areas where we have lost data for one reason or another, and reconstructing that, and to also expand out some of our duration counts into annualized averages so that we can compare them better to other data sources. And the other piece was just kind of getting an external perspective on what is this data really telling us. And that's especially true over this last couple of years. There have been major shifts during and after COVID. And so some of the trend lines just don't quite look the way that they used to. So getting into those findings here, looking at bike counts here from 5 continuous, reliable counters, 6 centers at 5 sites. We looked at some of the biggest picture trends. Over, nearly 600,000 bikes were counted overall during the most recent period of analysis, over 1,600 per day, and that's just on 5 corridors. We did see a teeny tiny bit of growth on weekdays compared to the previous year, but at the same time, there was this notable drop in weekends, which is something that we can maybe attribute to things kind of getting back to normal-ish in terms of COVID. Comparing those sites to one another, and I'll note here that 2 of these sites are actually just 2 halves of the same corridor, so you could add them back together. We see no surprise that sort of the showpiece spine of our local bike network, the Lafitte Greenway, just a lovely facility. It comes out on top, while one of our key bikeways downtown has still kind of stayed below pre-COVID volumes. It hasn't fully rebounded to where it was before, whereas another shared use trail that's along a park and gets mainly recreational users in a more suburban context around example. Comparing those to the previous year, we see that the overall bike volumes are down almost everywhere except for on the Greenway. There's not one simple explanation for this, I don't think, and that's one of the reasons we valued getting some perspective externally on what we were seeing. On the Lafitte Greenway, again, that busiest bikeway of the whole bunch, deeper dive into that data shows that it's busy pretty much all day, every day, and that's true even in the depths of summertime, which this year, for anybody else who's in the deep south, was a particularly brutally hot summer for just weeks and weeks on end. And this kind of information is important to show because a lot of people who are maybe going from air-conditioned cars to air-conditioned offices, back to their air-conditioned houses, are convinced that people will not and cannot bike here in the summer. But we can show that that is just demonstrably not the case. Of course, we're also looking at the data from month to month over time, and this is one of those places where eco-counters help in filling in some of the gaps so that we're looking at this accurately. It's really helpful for improving the data quality. And you can see that the volumes do drop in the summertime, but not actually as much as they do in the wintertime, which makes sense probably to northern folks, but might surprise people down here. You know, things get to a frigid 50-something degrees or so, and suddenly the bicyclists are a little bit more timid. I am also one of those lizard people, but it's good to be able to sort of point exactly what we're talking about. We do, however, bring out all of the bicycles to get to our many and beloved festivals. Looking at Jazz Fest alone this year, we counted over 11,000 trips on just 2 corridors that are sort of close by. One is very close and one is pretty close. And that's more than double our typical weekend traffic, even though it was a little bit of a decrease over last year's festival. Something we could maybe attribute to at least one of the days getting super rained out, just absolute torrential rains. You can also see that festival activity in the daily traffic patterns compared to normal times. And if you have been in New Orleans during Jazz Fest at exactly 7 p.m., right after the last set wraps up, you will deeply understand this chart because the only way that you are getting out of that neighborhood is if you are on a bicycle. So that is reflected in terms of the number of people who have made that choice. And of course, we have also got Mardi Gras. So for New Orleanians, that's actually a whole season. It's like 3 to 6 weeks. But if you zoom in on just Mardi Gras Day itself, we're looking at about 3 times as many bicyclists as normal. And none of our counters are actually that close to the epicenter of those activities. So if you multiply that by every bikeway that heads toward downtown or St. Charles Avenue, it's really clearly one of the bikiest days of the entire year. And then again, here's Mardi Gras Day compared to a normal Tuesday. That shows how everybody really gets rolling in the morning to get to their parades and their festivities downtown. Something that may be surprising to folks outside of New Orleans is that this is definitely not an all-night affair, though. Most of the locals are packing it up by about 5 p.m., which comes through in the data. It's worth noting that at this point, we've all been going for 6 days straight, and it is time to do nothing but go home and eat real food and watch some of it later. So another thing we asked the team for support with was to help us look at the data from some initial short duration counts that we collected. And we are now, this season in the process of going back and collecting recounts at those same locations so that we compare. And that included 3 new protected bikeways, one of which, when the data is annualized, actually represents the second highest total volume in our whole year. And that site, this North Peters Street here on the edge of the French Quarter, which is the second one from the left, has really always been this hub for people who are connecting to their jobs or to fun downtown. But now finally we have the kind of safe and protected infrastructure that we always really needed there. And we also have the data to prove it. It turns out it's a whole lot easier to count bikes in locations after you have built some kind of infrastructure that is safe and separated than it was before. Another location, similarly, Elysian Fields, we recently went back and recounted on to now that the protected bike lanes aren't brand new. And we're really pleased to see that there's signs of growth and more activity in that location, because sometimes it takes a minute for facilities to become part of people's regular routes and their routines. So it's really valuable to have this routine ongoing monitoring to be able to show that. Probably our best example of that point is the Norman Francis Parkway Trail, which is the place where we put our very first counter way back in 2010 and have been going just about nonstop since then. And year after year, up until COVID, we saw this strong and consistent growth. We hit the peak so far in 2020 with increases in both weekday and weekend riding. And this illustrates that from 2015 on, that's when we installed our first eco-multi that differentiates between bikes and pedestrians instead of lumping them all together. And we saw this big bump in activity during COVID as lots of people counting in lots of places did see. And then we saw a modest drop, as we also have elsewhere. But overall, we've managed to maintain 73% of the bicyclists that we were seeing at this location pre-COVID. So there's lots of things you can point to about what this trend is telling us and where to go from here. But it clearly points to still we have just really robust demand on this legacy bikeway that critically connects several neighborhoods together and also over a highway that would otherwise serve as a major barrier in coming along. Looking again at the trends before and during the pandemic at this location, which it also connects to basically the city's whole trail network. It's a really central location. It runs along a bayou. We saw that this is one of those places where weekend activity in particular was notably elevated during 2020, which to me suggests that it was really important for filling this role in people's recreation and just their mental health and sanity during that time. On weekdays, we saw that there was only a little bit more activity than normal overall, but that the trends were a little bit different. So there was less early morning traffic for commuters, a few more afternoon and early evening rides, and then less nighttime riding than we would normally see here, because this is also a place where we have lots of bars and restaurants that for part of that year were not operating. So that gives us some of the highlights of what our little network of counters shows us and how it helps to sort of illuminate what the bigger trends are for bicycling in New Orleans. Specifically, it's great that we have these counters on some of the most active routes in the city, and that can help us to infer things about what we can expect to see as we continue to build out our network and have more of those high quality and protected facilities. We're able to look at the impacts of major festivals and events, and that's the impact that the festivals have on bicycling, but also the impact that bicycling has for festivals and for those type of events. And we can show the growth in that over time and changes. And then we were able to show, how to interpret shorter term counts, which we can do at more locations around the city with just a couple of different count units. And ultimately, all of this is in service to helping to tell the story of how infrastructure investment and community effort has over time fostered significant demand for bicycling in the city, as well as to maybe help us point to areas where some more attention is needed. I can't, ignore some of the challenges that we have experienced throughout the years as we've worked on this. As I'm sure our friends at EcoTownter could also attest, we've had maybe more environmental challenges than some, thanks to our extreme heat and hot weather that we tend to get. And also, we've had probably more than a typical amount of data loss that resulted from equipment damage, mostly due to some really notably spectacularly bad driving. We've had 5 counter posts, and it doesn't affect this data too much because it's mostly counting pedestrians. But we've had 5 of them that have been hit by cars, which is crazy because these are all on off-street trails and there should not be any cars. So that's just one of the challenges of where we're at, I guess. And then, of course, just keeping it going is a constant challenge. We haven't been able to fully institutionalize this work with the same kind of recurring funding stream that we see for cars. But we are incrementally working toward that kind of sustainability and having these interdisciplinary partnerships where it lightens the load a little bit on everybody helps to get us there, thanks to that collaboration. And so finally, I kind of wanted to turn it over to 2 of those collaborators that I've mentioned, Jennifer Ruley at the City of New Orleans and Christina at Bike Easy. And they have been really instrumental in not just working on this project and steering that, but also really in just so much of the work that has led to New Orleans building a bike network in the first place, and then also creating community and education around bicycling over the last 20 years. So maybe I'll start by handing it off to Jennifer to just tell us sort of what are we doing with all of this data now, and where do you see us going from here?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I'm Jennifer Ruley. I'm the division manager for mobility and safety in our Department of Public Works here in New Orleans. And I'm really excited that we have this data at this point because some of the same streets and facilities that Tara presented on earlier, we got a lot of, I guess, pushback at the beginning when we were trying to do these projects, when we were trying to justify bike lanes and road diets and even trail connections from people in the community who didn't think that it was needed, or why are we focusing on that kind of thing. And so the data just justifies a lot for us. It's a way to make the case that this is a very, we're meeting a huge demand in the city. And so, and my role within Public Works is to figure out, what do we prioritize, and how do we use this kind of data to make decisions and that sort of thing. So the key ways that we are using these are there three. One is focusing on connectivity, really ensuring that we can connect these routes in a way that's meaningful, logical, and gets people to where they need to go. So really looking at streets or facilities like Lafitte Greenway, Esplanade as spines in the network, and then working to connect off of there to the destination. So we have an example is 1.5 million that we're investing in improvements to connecting to and from the Greenway. And then we're also focusing on a major project to extend the Lafitte Greenway. So really investing where we've seen this pay off in utilization rates in a big way. The other way that we're looking at this is for short trips. So looking at where we can focus on where people are making short trips, say under a mile, and where we can shift those trips away from automobile trips to non-motorized transportation or some sort of multimodal transportation, even if that is transit. So really, understanding the fact that we have 20% of households don't have access to a private vehicle, and then we also have data on chronic diseases that we can use in order to really facilitate that kind of conversation and discussion within the neighborhoods. And New Orleans, it's got some off the chart kind of rates of hypertension and diabetes and things like that. And so just looking at how we can use other types of data to help to augment the data that Tara has mentioned. And then the third one is kind of a surprise to us, but makes sense, is the festivals and special events. So really using that data to say, how can we take something that is a essential part of New Orleans identity, the festival special events, and really optimize how much we can invest in incentivizing multimodal goals for those types of events. So really looking at policies and incentives around bike parking, bike share, wayfinding systems that even pop up during a special event, which has happened during Jazz Fest as an example, and then use of things like transit, that sort of thing. So we're looking at ways we can really take something that's already happening and then really focus on how do we get those event organizers to think more about how people are coming and going from the festivals. So those are some quick ways, and I really appreciate the fact that this has been a really unique partnership with, a university and then an advocacy organization and even a corporation whose foundation funded this work. So really excited about how this all came together and hope to continue. Elaine, do you want to talk to Bike Easy's role and take on these things?
Sure. So hello, my name is Elaine Lespina. I'm the executive director at Bike Easy. For those who don't know anything about Bike Easy, we're a local nonprofit. We've been around for 20 years. We started as the Metro Bicycle Coalition as a small group of volunteers, just having some drinks and saying, let's make bicycling better in New Orleans. So over 20 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the city. And my role at Bike Easy more officially came almost at the tail end of the Big Jump program, where People for Bikes was really helping out expand the network rapidly in the city. Since then, we've seen a lot of changes in our elected officials, our council, and priorities in general when it comes to people biking in our city. So for the last couple of years, we have been working into trying to better understand what are the needs and the concerns of the bike community and really try to connect with them. Around the same time, we were talking with Tara and Jennifer and kind of trying to explore all these data and figuring out ways, how can we tell stories with these in a way that's easier for people like me to understand? And how can I use these as an advocate to tell stories to our council members and our elected officials and our state representatives to better justify why it's important to invest in our network? So it's been a passion project. It's so great to kind of see it come to fruition, but it's been a great partnership in terms of not just mixing the numbers, but we put out a couple surveys. I know we've mentioned a lot, Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest, vital events in our city that draw a lot of people, not only locals, but people from outside of the city, which also means that there is more conflict on the streets because there's more people using the streets. And if you're not sharing it in a safe way, that's where issues can arise. And, there's been a lot of, unfortunately, fatal crashes because of that. So having this data helps us justify we are not invisible. It's important that we keep people safe. People are using these facilities. So that's been a very useful thing for us as advocates. And then the other thing I think I would mention is in this partnership, I think one of the good things that came out too is as we're working on new projects, we look back and say, has any data been collected before we lay ground, during, and after? And just being more conscious about being mindful where we're sending some folks sometimes to do data collection so we can show the impact of facilities, especially when they have protected bike lanes. How does that impact ridership? So I think in that sense, it's been a great conversation and a great partnership. And yeah, I mean, some of the other work we do is education and community. So again, that goes alongside of having conversations with festival organizers or Mardi Gras organizers on what kind of transportation planning are they putting in place to make sure that people that are coming to their events, or people who are just doing their 9 to 5 during Mardi Gras need to get places. How are we factoring this into that? So, I mean, I think that's all I would add to that, but it's been a really exciting project.
Awesome, thank you. So that's our story. If you want to learn more about the specific project that we have been working on this year, we've been posting as pieces as soon as we get done with them here, and we can certainly share that out afterward. And we'll be adding sort of the content that's come from this collaboration with the American Bicyclists and Eco Counter to that location in the very near future. So I think now we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Awesome, thanks. Let me get everybody's cameras back on for all of us. Hold on 1 second. There we go. Okay, hopefully attendees can see all of us now. Great, thank you all so much. That was wonderful. And I really do want to emphasize the power of partnerships is something I love in this story, and especially with the city and advocates and researchers and hearing about the corporate support. And it's just very inspiring. And I hope others in the audience are thinking about who in their community they're not yet engaging in this work, but could be, and finding inspiration from the New Orleans story. So thank you. I have Olivia back, and then I also wanted to introduce David from Eco Counter, who's here to answer questions as well. So I do encourage attendees to put questions in the chat, and I will be moderating, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Let's see. I want to start out by asking about that corporate sponsorship piece, because I think that is kind of unique. I haven't seen that elsewhere. And I'm just curious how it came to be. Did Entergy approach you all, or did somebody pitch them on supporting this work? Because I know funding proper data collection can be a challenge for some communities and finding the resources to do it. So I'd love to hear the backstory of how that came to be.
Sure. Jennifer is sort of she's our original point of connection here. Entergy has a grant program that they support, various causes throughout the year. I know Bike Easy has had a partnership with Entergy for various programming that y'all do for years now. So I think there was sort of a pre-existing relationship, being familiar with Jennifer's work, both in her current capacity and previous capacity, and their previous commitments to this sort of environmental work and public health work, and seeing that this was filling just a void in that there. I don't know if there's anything y'all wanted to add about how that came to be.
Yeah, I would just add that it was, they helped to fund technical assistance in the early days of building out our network. And they saw this as something that was part of their corporate social responsibility obligation in the city. And so they have an investment in, they didn't actually pay for the infrastructure to be built out, but they facilitated the capacity to actually build it out. So they want to see what those numbers look like now. And that was their incentive for being involved.
Yeah, and for Bike Easy, they actually were the first ones to think about a Bike to Work Day event in the city. This idea was born in a conference room somewhere in Entergy, and they started supporting Bike to Work Day that then turned into Bike to Work Week, that then it turned to the April Challenge. So yeah, our relationship with them has been pretty strong for over a decade.
That's great, thank you. And a question for the EcoCounter folks: how have these findings compared to other cities that you work with? Both that the data you looked at as part of this project, but in general, hearing some of the findings today, how does this compare to the other cities you work with?
I could jump in without naming any specific cities. Seeing counts rise dramatically over the first year of the pandemic, especially recreational trips. So trips that we typically see outside of the typical commuting hours in the morning and afternoon of weekdays. They exploded, and they have generally since tapered off. Sites where we used to see the greatest traffic, which might be a bike facility that cuts through the downtown area or central business districts, tend to be where counts have dropped the most and are starting to rebound on weekdays, as we saw in the New Orleans data. So we're seeing more and more weekday traffic. If you looked at the hourly profiles and compared it to pandemic or pre-pandemic, we're kind of tending back towards those, standard work week types of fluctuations and counts. But we're still in a transition. People are still working from home, something I do a couple days a week. And so that's certainly going to have a negative impact on the number of commuting trips that we see. So we're moving back towards pre-2020, but in most cities we're still not quite there in terms of those levels.
Thank you. And we got a couple of questions about asking for the link. So thank you, Tara, for putting that in the chat. In case anybody didn't notice it, it should be there for you. And we got a question about how count reports are made available to the public and sort of what that process looks like. So curious from the city perspective, or Tara or Aline, sort of how the city sort of approaches that of making these count reports publicly available.
So I can say that historically, the approach to count reports was, UNO as the sort of prime investigator doing the research, puts together a big report. We hand it off to our government partner, whether that's the state or the MPO, and what they do with it is mostly up to them. And so what happens sometimes is that they have it and sometimes use it regularly, but it doesn't really go further than that. And so that's what we were trying to change with this project. So instead of doing a big annual report where we just dump mountains of charts on people, instead every month or more frequently in some cases, we have been doing a highlight, which is 2 to 4 pages of highly visual content that Bike Easy again has been helping to make sensible for regular people to be able to access, that focuses on something in particular. So, one month we may be focused on a specific corridor or a specific neighborhood, or looked just at festivals, or looked at specifically pedestrian counts where we have those. So we've been trying to make it much more digestible, and then just instead of waiting until the end of the project, after a year, let's just start getting stuff up there as we have it, so that it can be used and hopefully iterated on in the future.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I mean, I think the whole point is to make sure people use data as a resource. So it's in this particular website, we not only have the data highlights, but we have quick access to the transportation safety dashboard that was put by the city, the ADA dashboard. So we're trying to put things that we feel is going to be useful for one person to just go to one place and kind of grab as much information as they can, versus this was part of the problem, trying to dig and dig and dig and knock on many doors to just find the information. It's let's make it easy for folks to access so people become more aware of it.
Yeah, and I was going to add that we're also putting it out in the physical space. So if you, as you go down Lafitte Greenway, or as you go down, you know, another street or that kind of thing, we're putting down the profile for that street so that someone who may not be aware of the website, they can actually see the data, maybe stop and look at it and, you know, understand that they're counted. So Tara, I think, just went and put those signs up yesterday.
Yeah, just started to, and more to come when I get the right Torx bit.
That's awesome. And then we've gotten some questions about developing a public-facing dashboard on a city website. Any insights on that? Including, there was a separate question about finding information visualization partners. So this question could be for any of the speakers, I feel like.
Yeah, I'll start. So, I mean, the city has actually done some significant work in creating dashboards, the ones that Aline mentioned about accessibility and, you know, safety that live in various locations. So wherever those already existed, we're like, cool, we'll just use that. We're not going to recreate this here. We kind of went back and forth about where is all this content going to live, since it's owned by all of us collectively. And the idea is we just want it to be as accessible as possible. Settled on having it live on Bike Easy's homepage, just because it is a lot faster and simpler to update a nonprofit's webpage as opposed to a university or a government agency, where maybe there's a few more layers of things that you have to go through in order to make changes and additions. And we wanted to be, for the purpose of this, just more nimble than that, which I think has worked out great. And then, you know, long term, we do, you know, hope that the city will continue to have some ownership over this. So maybe some of it'll migrate in the future. We shall see.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you go to that CountDad website or webpage that Tara provided, you can see some of the other related dashboards that the city's pushed out. So they're linked to city dashboards on that site too.
That's great. And that actually leads nicely to a question I was thinking about asking. We have a lot of bike advocates on the call, and they might be in cities that aren't already doing counts or aren't as receptive to these kinds of partnerships. So I'm wondering if any of you have advice for local advocates in other cities on how to approach a city to say, we should partner on this together, or here's how I could help. And I think offering to host the dashboard for the city is a great starting place if the city has data. But any other ideas or suggestions for bike advocates on how they can support these efforts in their communities?
I just say a big advice is don't get overwhelmed too easily. When it comes to data, it's suddenly like, you know, try to find the right partnerships, and, you know, to talk to a lot of people till you find that perfect mix, because, you know, people want to share their knowledge. And I think that as advocates, one of our big roles is to kind of bring people together and create champions within our community. So I think it's like, use those skills to bring something that could be intimidating as collecting data. Like, you know, if you have your graphic designers in your own team, bring them together to help put these things as a resource for folks. So I would just say, like, don't be overwhelmed, but just, you know, knock on doors and try to find the right mix and just persevere. Because again, this started as a passion project 2 years ago, and then now it's like full on. So, you know, it's like building the bike lane. It takes years. So think about it that way, by little chunks.
Totally. I would add too that just from the sort of pragmatic perspective, because the first thing that comes up is always like, we can't do that, it costs money. The FHWA has very helpfully put out this like big table of all of the various bike ped expenditures and which programs that's an eligible expense for, and count equipment and data collection is an eligible expense for like a lot of them. So what I've been trying to push people on, especially when I'm working outside of New Orleans, of smaller towns in Louisiana and things like that, is like, if you could just include a little bit extra in that grant proposal budget to include monitoring and evaluation, you're setting yourself up for success for the next grant application, because you could prove that the first thing you did had an impact. So that's been so far like a successful pitch. It's hopefully we'll start to see it live and in action as people start to get funded on projects where they thought to add that extra 5K or whatever to buy something to include, because it's a lot easier to start monitoring if you're installing it at the time of construction instead of having to go back in. So that's one of the places we're trying to encourage folks to go.
Awesome. And if you haven't seen that table, I just put it in the chat. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay. All right, I would also add that from like the city's perspective, if you can get a meeting with your folks at the city, that's the first step. All right, and then have that conversation and say, you know, what are your needs? How can we help you? And really, that's where, you know, Tara's expertise and grant writing ability, and along with Olene's, has really been helpful to us, because we weren't putting it all together yet, and so they helped to meet that need.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we are at time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to end our Q&A, but I apologize. There were some questions we didn't get to, but we'll try to reach out to folks that asked really specific things that we might be able to provide answers on. And one question we didn't get to was, how do I get the recording for today? We will be emailing it out to everyone who registered for the webinar, and also posting it on the League's blog at bikeleague.org/blog. So that should be up in the next couple of days. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much to all of our awesome presenters for being role models as advocates and cities and researchers, and really great partners. EcoCounter, we're so grateful for your ongoing participation in this work. And yeah, we really look forward to continuing the conversation with you all and future data related webinars. And I feel like we could do a webinar a week on different cool initiatives going on in New Orleans. So thanks really to all of you for all your work there. And yeah, everybody have a great day, and see you on the next webinar. Take care. Bye.